Segal, I'm John Kane. Welcome to Let's Talk Native. In 1997, the film In Whose Honor was released. This was the first film to finally give voice to Native people speaking out against the use of Native imagery, symbols, and references for the mascots of sports teams at the college and professional levels. Since then, we have made tremendous strides in this effort, but certainly not without the help from many Native and non-Native activists. Today, my guest is Jay Rosenstein. Jay produced and directed In Whose Honor. He is a Peabody and Emmy Award-winning independent filmmaker who has been writing, producing, and editing documentaries since 1991. In Whose Honor is a 48-minute documentary broadcast in the late 90s on PBS stations across the United States as part of the POV television series. The film follows Charlene Teeters as she fights to protect her cultural identity, battling the University of Illinois over the mockery displayed with their mascot. Through the point of view of Charlene, Jay is able to use the film to examine the issues of racism, stereotypes, and minority representation in the mass media, as well as the lengths to which one university and its supporters will go to defend their offensive mascot. Jay has also lectured and written extensively about the use of Native mascots and remains a resource for many of us as we continue this work to eliminate this identity theft and cultural appropriation. Jay holds a master's degree in journalism from the University of Illinois, Urbana, where he has taught until his recent retirement as an associate professor of journalism. Jay Rosenstein, welcome to Let's Talk Native.
When you bring up the Marxist thing, right, which, it doesn't even make any sense. But, I think what that is it's sort of taken straight out of right-wing Republican playbook, which is that, you hear all the Trump people and the people on the right and the right-wing media people constantly referring to people on the left as Marxists. So I think they just picked up on that. And they just say it. I did listen to a long presentation that was given here in Champaign by some of the folks from that organization, and sort of trying to get a sense of what their actual arguments are that they're making. And first of all, one of their primary ones, which is so laughable and it's ridiculous, is that that getting rid of mascots is performing cultural genocide. They use the word genocide, and I always think someone needs to explain to you what the definition of what genocide really is. And you should know, if you're Native, you should damn well know what a real genocide is. But the idea that you take away a sports mascot, which or a logo. And I also try to point out to them, those logos, they like to call those Indian imagery. You say, oh, they're banning Indian imagery. And I like to point out, the thing that they're banning is a drawing that was made by a white guy. So how is that Indian imagery? Because every one of those logos really, for the most part, is, it's a drawing by a white guy. Okay. And so that doesn't tell you anything about Indian imagery, but again, there's sort of no logic to their arguments. And in a way they are modeled again after Fox News and after, these kind of right-wing ways of spreading propaganda. And, I've heard Eunice Davidson, I think her name is, talk, who I think is maybe the president now or the head or something. And her thing was, the only people who are opposed to mascots are like a handful of liberal academic faculty, white academic, and I guess now we're Marxist. I don't know. And the reason she knows that is because, well, every Native person she knows likes mascots. I mean, that's her piece of evidence. And you say, well, you know what? Go to my website. I have a list of tribes that have all come out with tribal resolutions against mascots, and that's not including the National Congress of American Indians and all that. And then they argue that, well, those really aren't the people; those are just, these, So her only piece of evidence about whether natives like or don't like mascots is that everyone she knows likes them.
Her own echo chamber, right?
And so that's all she's got. And then the other thing that they've got is that that anonymous telephone poll that was done by Sports Illustrated about the Washington team,
self-identifying,
yeah, exactly, on the telephone.
Yeah,
so anyone is, are you Native American? Sure, I'm Native American. What do you want to know?
Well, I'll even take that a step farther. I mean, one of the things that, in fact, I just posted something recently on social media that there's a lot of talk about this population explosion because of the last census that was done, and that Native people, that our population has grown. I says, you do realize that there's no verification for anybody to claim who claims that they're Native American on those census forms. And we don't exactly have great participation on the U.S. Census on our territories. I mean, I didn't respond. I mean, nobody came knocking on my door. And, so there is a complete disconnect. Much of the data that is associated, especially at the federal level, with our numbers. I mean, I feel much more confident if I wanted to find out how many Senecas there were, I'd get a hold of the Seneca Nation. I wouldn't try to go to the Bureau of Indian Affairs for that information.
Right.
And of course, you're right. This whole idea of people who are self-identifying as Native for these polls. I mean, there's no suggestion that they called Native territories. There's also the way the question is asked. I mean, it is one thing if you ask somebody, do you find such and such offensive? It's another thing when you break it down a little farther and you say, well, how do you feel about non-Native people dressed in regalia parading themselves across a football field? Or, I mean, I find one of the most absurd images is the Florida State mascot who rides a horse, calls himself Chief Osceola, and throws a spear. Seminoles in Florida weren't horse people, and so the whole thing is absurd on so many different levels. But going back to your issue about the artwork that they brandish, if you look on the East Coast anyway, 30 or 40 schools use almost the identical image, just with different colors to it, and it's clip art.
Yes,
I mean it's basically clip art from the internet, and so. How are you trying to suggest that this is some special imagery that is meant to honor anybody when it's really just something you probably didn't even pay for because it was just plucked from the public domain, for crying out loud? I mean, it's really that absurd.
Yeah, there was a team that I think it was a hockey team on the West Coast, a minor league hockey team, that dropped their logo, and it was an exact plagiarized copy of the Chicago Blackhawks logo. It was identical. And because I had never heard of this team, and then they said, here's their logo. And I looked at it and they did just what you said. They just grabbed the Blackhawks logo and put their own name under it, and it became their logo. It was interesting because I was surprised that the Chicago Blackhawks hadn't found them. But I think, when you talk about those images, right there, you're speaking to the crux of the problem, which is that for most white people, and I'm a white person, so understand that I'm within that group. You see those images, and that's of course all you know about an Indian, and those images and mascots are a white person's sort of fantasy of what an Indian looks like.
Well, and you get it, and you're touching on a bunch of significant things there, and among them is again the harm that is done not just to Native people but to the white kids who are being taught that is what and of course it's not just that is what an Indian is, but when you by identifying us so strongly, or our existence to that imagery, it's like we don't exist anymore. We only exist in these past, overused stereotypical images. And
That's right.
so we are rendered as objects of the past and limited in a timestamp that's what we were, and almost like that's what we always were. And so you that kind of, I tell a story sometimes about meeting, some high level Department of Commerce gentleman from Washington who had come to an incubator in the area, not far from Seneca territory, that opened up. And when he was introduced to a Seneca business person, and he was introduced by saying, "This is such and such. He's one of the more prominent Seneca entrepreneurs in the area." He literally asked him if his work was in beads and leather. I mean, and we were literally standing there with our mouths hanging open because we knew he wasn't being a jerk. I mean, intentionally, he wasn't trying to be a smart ass. I mean, he's serious. Just ignorant. So this uninformed. Is a government. Well, ignorant is the right. I mean, a government official who should know something about commerce, should know something about native commerce, could have such an ignorant response. And I gotta think, well, what was he ever taught? And as I've done work and I've done public events and, not just radio and television, oftentimes I get the response I get from people is that they can't believe how much their education has betrayed them, that they didn't know, so much of the things that I might present, whether it's in a speech or a film screening or something like that. And, and it really is unfortunate, but it gets back to what you were just saying about what these kids are being taught. And of course, the history, one of the things that you didn't get to this, but one of the things that Guardians Association suggests is their new tagline is educate, not eradicate. Yeah. Of course, they actually spelled eradicate wrong in their filings, I think, because if you spell it with an IRR, it doesn't mean the same thing as eradicate with an E. But anyway, but the problem with that is, look at what education there is right now. They're still teaching happy little pilgrims and happy little Indians, stories about Thanksgiving. They're still telling the Pocahontas myth. I mean, that's been debunked so many times, and I don't care if Disney does a film on it. There's nothing to suggest that Pocahontas and John Smith ever had any kind of relationship, but that's what's still being taught. So not only do we have the Christopher Columbus myth that is still being jammed down our throats, but we have all of this
that's
stuff.
Getting better.
Well, and it is getting better. And next week,
definitely getting better.
Next week we'll celebrate.
Statues got pulled down.
Yep, and we'll celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, where many places are finally bailing on it. But again, those statues coming down, that again, I'm going to attribute some of that back to Black Lives Matter, because as they were pulling down Confederate statues, they were pulling down.
Right, they're like, what are we doing with these? Get this guy down. This guy came in and murdered God knows how many millions of Native people, and there's a statue of him.
But they still haven't changed how they're teaching it in school, though. So even as that's happening in the public, and I think people are responding to that, there's still really bad things, really erroneous things. So, when we talk about education, there's what to teach, but there's also what you need to stop teaching, and you need to stop telling some of the stuff. Look, there was a great documentary done by Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes. I don't know if you had a chance to see that or not.
No, but I know the name.
And the one criticism I had, and in fact, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz contributed. She was a consultant on the film. And I had her on my show. I says, the one thing that bugged me is when he finally got to a place where he wanted to talk about the fact that we still exist, and he wanted to cite examples of some of our accomplished Native peoples. Everybody he listed was somebody who somehow could demonstrate their accomplishment within the colonial system. So, I mean, and I'm not condemning somebody like Joy Harjo, but Joy Harjo is the poet laureate. So she's recognized there, in their system. They, he mentions or puts up Deb Haaland and Sharice David and some other people who were elected into office, or they'll put code talkers up, but they don't put those of us who are still fighting the federal government, and sometimes fighting troops or police over pipelines or land use and that kind of thing. So getting back to this issue about education, if all you're going to do is teach about assimilated Native people, then that doesn't really do us any good either. And let's face it, if the only reason you're adding another layer of education to your curriculum is to justify your mascot, you can only imagine what they're going to be teaching. I mean, they're going to be, they're not going to be teaching anything that could be in the slightest way construed to critical race theory or anything that's going to make white people uncomfortable. And so that's that's just a red herring all by itself as well.
Well, the irony, of course, of their slogan, first of all, eradication. I mean, just look at the word they use, eradication. Like you get rid of a drawing of an Indian by a white guy, and that's eradicating the race. And that, again, that's their argument. It's an all or nothing thing. But the other part of that is they act as though you can't do education and get rid of mascots. Like it's either or. So you better keep the mascot or else you can't have education, which is nonsense. And of course, the irony is the more real education that people get, the more likely they are going to say, let's get rid of these racist, so education is not what they want. They only want a certain kind of education.
They want propaganda, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I've seen that come up here locally with a certain individual who's long been, one of the leading advocates for keeping the mascot here and bringing it back and all that. And this person constantly complains about what's being taught at the American Indian Studies department at the University of Illinois. And the reason why is because he doesn't like it because it's it's real history that's being taught by actual credible, people who know the history. And, and then he complains that there's no education. Well, there is education, but you don't like it because it doesn't fulfill your goal, which is to tell people that the mascot is good, which is really all you want.
Right.
You don't really care about anything else. Just do that, and that's all that'll matter.
Well, and the other thing is, along with that eradicating language that they use in their slogan now, is this cancel culture and some of these other right wing lines that are repeated over and over again.
Right.
And the suggestion that somehow removing a Native mascot is erasure. And any of us who have actually looked at this with even a passing glance know that it's the mascots that are the erasure, because we aren't the ones who define that identity. I mean, there's a lot of conversation today, about Facebook and social media and the harm that they're doing to body shaming and all this other stuff.
Sure.
But there's a part of me that says, look what we've experienced because of Hollywood's fabrication of our identity. We are battling with that today in a way from images that they created 50, 60, 70 years ago. So while I'm not defending social media, when I think about what magazines and television and Hollywood has done to define what somebody is or what they're supposed to be, it's a much bigger problem than social media. And to some extent, social media at least allows us to push back. We could never push back against Hollywood. I mean, look at one of the most famous Native images in all of television. It was the PSA that Iron Eyes Cody, was filmed in the Crying Indian.
Oh yeah.
And he was Sicilian. He wasn't. They couldn't even grab a Native person for the role. and so that imagery ends up being what everybody thinks, and that's even more confusing because you have a period, somebody in period dress that looks anachronistic to somebody throwing fast food garbage at his feet along the highway and that kind of stuff. But I mean, we find ourselves in a tough spot where we have white people saying, "Well, you don't look Native," or
sure.
you're because they already have this image of what we're supposed to look like. I mean,
Absolutely.
and this has been built upon. It was frankly even before Hollywood. I mean, I'm one of the few people who cite the genocide editorials of L. Frank Baum I don't know if you're familiar. L. Frank Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. He
Yeah.
wrote these 2 editorials where he was basically calling for our extermination. And when, in doing so, he said, why not annihilation? Their glory is fled. Their manhood has been effaced. Better they die than live the miserable wretches that they are. And then he says, people will speak in later ages of the grand kings of the forest and plain. And so what he was really saying is, let's not let Native people who exist today ruin the legacy that we want to create their image of. And to me, Baum laid down the foundation for what would be this whole mascot movement in the first place. I mean, you've got a guy who's basically saying, we're going to recreate what we think Native people should represent, and we're not going to let Native people screw that up for us. And he was basically calling for our extermination. And in doing so, it was like within 2 weeks, the massacre of Wounded Knee took place after his first genocide editorial. So it wasn't done without harm, put it that way. But but this is the experience that we have when we don't have the opportunity to define ourselves. I mean, look, even as I tell somebody that I'm Mohawk, that's not even our word. I mean, our word for who is Gunyagahaga. It means the people of the land of Flint. How many of the words that are used, even the so-called tribe names, I mean, where does Lac de Flambeau come from? I mean,
well, you know what? Well, you can tell where it comes from. It comes from the French.
Exactly.
But see, well, we have the same thing in Illinois. You know, people say, oh, well, you know, when we oppose the mascot here, they always go, well, what's next? You're going to get us to try to change the name of the state because it's named after, an Indian or an Indian tribe. And it's like, no, it's not really. It's a French transliteration of what a French explorer thought he heard, right? Because we don't really know what was said. Yeah. And it came out as Illinois. But, it's like Lac de Flambeau. Look at the spelling. It's obviously, it's not authentic in any way. It's what a white person thought he heard, right? Yep. He thought he heard them because, there's no recordings, there's no nothing. Yeah. So, but yes, it's that same thing. It's funny you mention that because I've been to Lac de Flambeau.
Yeah, so have I.
and actually that was an important part of my own self-education about Indian people was spending time up in Lac de Flambeau and meeting, making some friends and meeting some Ojibwa people there. And that was actually a really important experience for me because when you talk about the school systems, et cetera, I went through those school systems. I went to an all-white high school. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. If I had ever seen a Native person in my life, I didn't even know it. Right. I don't know what a Native person was beyond the stereotypes. And it's not as though I had any sort of prejudice or anything. I just, if you'd asked me, have you ever met an Indian person? I would have thought, hell no, I don't, how would I know? I don't know. I don't think so. So I came through that too. And I had to go through the process of learning. And part of making the film in whose honor was also giving me a chance to immerse myself even deeper into that and learn so much more. So it's funny. So then, my kids then are being raised and they were coming up through the public school system here. And what I did for my youngest, Robert Warrior is a professor. Now he's at Kansas, but he used to be here at Illinois, and we actually lived in the same neighborhood. And one of his girls was also friends of my daughter. But at any rate, when it was getting to the point in school where she was going to be learning about, teepees and the whole thing, I made sure the way I emphasized it is, okay, yeah, that's the way Indian people lived a long, long time ago. But Robert Warrior, right? Where does he live? Yeah. He lives in a house just the same as our damn house. He lives right down the street, And so it was actually useful for me to have a living person that I could point to. And I say, does he wear feathers in his hair and buckskin? How does he dress? He wears the same clothes that I do, jeans, and whatever. And so it did help. And I think, that speaks to the fact that if there isn't any real presence of real people, it's hard for non-native people to get a handle on so many things without having anyone there to even be an example for you.
Well, and there's also just a huge absence in awareness of the conditions that many native territories exist as today and why they exist this way. I mean, look, as we battle the residential school debate that is going on, and that obviously got a bunch of
talking about issues now coming. Oh my God, right?
But one of the reasons they did that, they claimed part of the justification for ripping kids out of their homes by the federal government, both on the Canadian and the U.S. side, was the conditions of our territory. But they created those conditions. So there's there's the whole idea of this self-fulfilling prophecy that they make life unlivable, and then suggest that the only solution is to rip our kids away and then assimilate them, forced assimilation. And the irony, of course, is that while this is happening to our children for 100 years, is when white kids are being encouraged to dress up, put mom's makeup on their face, and play Indian. I mean, there's an absurdity of Boy Scouts too. Yeah, right.
Boy Scouts, that's a big place where that gets injected, or used to get injected into young boys' heads. Sure. This mystery and beauty and fantasy about Indian people. Boy Scouts is huge in doing that.
But there, I mean, there could be nothing more absurd than the dichotomy between white schools encouraging children to play Indian and these residential schools where children were not just beaten and abused, but they died. In these
Some
schools.
Were murdered, yeah.
And the slogan was "Kill the Indian, save the man." Right. I mean, I mean, you would think when you have that conversation, there would be no more conversation needed. I mean, it's kind of like when the guy from Philadelphia who used to paint his face green and would impale the rubber head, and when the Eagles would play the Washington football team, he'd hoist up the impaled Indian head. You would think, once that picture went public, the debate would have been over. You think the first time somebody put up a sign that said, "Get ready for another Trail of Tears," the debate would be over. But it isn't. I mean, and I dare say, if that Philadelphia fan had taken a head that was black and put RG3 across the head and hoisted that up, he would have been dragged out of there. If somebody put up a banner that says "Get ready for a train to Auschwitz," there's no way. But part of the issue, and that's why the allies that we have, yourself included, we couldn't do this on our own. We've been trying it's actually been almost 50 years. And you're right, Black Lives Matter did give a huge jolt towards some level of consciousness associated with social justice, and we have been the beneficiary of some of those movements, even if it wasn't intended. I mean, when I saw Colin Kaepernick take the next step beyond kneeling because of black people that were being killed by police, but then travel to Alcatraz and do and stand up for some of the things that he stood up for.
Right.
I realized that those allies are the ones that are really going to help us make the difference in some of what we're trying to do.
Well, as someone who thinks of myself as an ally, and I've tried to live that consistently, one of the problems that allies face is the fact that you stand up, but of course then people say, well, you're just trying to speak for Native people. Who are you to speak for Native people? Why don't I see any Native people around here? And I have always tried to be as absolutely careful as I can to never in any way suggest that I'm speaking for Native people or that I am Native. And usually when I speak, I always make that clear right from the start. I'm not a Native person. I do not represent Native people. I can only tell you what I have learned from the Native people who I know.
Right.
And that's the way I do it. But so sometimes allies, we're sort of stuck in a, an uncomfortable middle situation where at the same time, you don't want to assert yourself as a white person and drown out a Native person in doing that. Right. So, you want to make sure that you give the Native people a chance to have the first voice. So, you have to watch out for that. And then if they're so hopelessly outnumbered, which happens in a lot of places, that they really, and I have had colleagues here, Native colleagues, ask me, specifically for help. can you help? Because I can't do this anymore. I can't step forward. I can't even think about it anymore.
No, there's a burnout. There's a burnout that people experience in this,
right?
And so it's hard to do this for a long time.
Oh God, you know that. But you step forward then as a non-native person, and then you have to take the criticism that you're not a native person. So it gets a little hard. But I've always felt very comfortable and confident in the place that I've tried to put myself as an advocate, and again, make very clear, I'm not a native person. I don't represent any native person. I don't speak for native people. And also, even in making In Whose Honor, I made a very concerted effort to never in any of the narration say anything that sounded like I was speaking for a native person. In other words, the whole idea was let the native people speak. That was sort of one of the fundamentals of the film, was let the native people say their piece or say what they have to say. Don't try to interpret it for them or reshape it. Let the native people speak. Let people hear what they have to say. One of the most dedicated allies here at the University of Illinois on this issue is a retired professor named Steve Kaufman. And Steve is interesting because he tried to continue to think about this issue in a very strategic way. In other words, you don't have the numbers, so you're always going to lose on majority. So you can't win that.
No public referendums, right?
Yes, exactly, because you can't win that. But he was always thinking strategically, like, where is a place where there's an opening that we might be able to get in? One of the things he did was, when the university here was actually going through its not confirmation, I forgot, the word escapes me right now, but he sort of snuck into that and brought the mascot issue into that and kind of threw that process off for the institution. So my point is, he's really the one, I think, more than anyone, who essentially came up with the idea of, what if we can influence the NCAA to take a stand? And then you don't have to go from school to school, right? And so he had spent a lot of time working with people from the NCAA and actually drove his car down there and met with Miles Brand, who was, I think, the president at the time. Met face-to-face meeting. He brought a local native man, wonderful guy who sadly just passed away recently, named Durango Mendoza, who's in my film as well. And they drove to and had a sit down with Miles Brand, and really was able to convince him of the magnitude of this problem. And so anyways, this is a long story, but when you talk about allies, I think it's important that Steve's contribution needs to be known by everyone, that he was really, more than anyone, the guy who did the behind the scenes work to make that happen. Because I don't think it would have happened without him.
Well, and I know there are certain names that people are drawn to in this battle, and there have been many people who have been a part of taking this fight on, and I sometimes think there is false credit given to some people. I mean, I remember when Barack Obama weighed in on the Washington football name, and do you remember his quote? It was something along the lines, "If I had a team, and if that team had a name, in spite of its storied tradition and history, had a name that a significant number of people found offensive, I think about changing the name." I mean, how many hypotheticals can you put in one goddamn sentence? I mean, why couldn't Barack Obama just said, no, Washington should change the name? I actually got into an argument with Suzanne Harjo on one of my shows, because I said, yeah, because she was trying to defend his comment. I said, no, that's not what he said. I mean, he didn't say, he never flat out came out and said they should change the name. I mean, he created this whole series of hypotheticals, and the worst one was the suggestion that a significant number of people had to be offended by it. Because by any account, we aren't a significant number. I mean, if you compare us to the rest of the population, like you said earlier, we are never going to have the numbers. So if we don't have allies, if we don't have the means to force this, essentially force this change, and look, and there are places that are more woke than others, but there's also pockets of deep-seated conservatism that have politicized everything from wearing a mask and vaccines to to this. And you can't change those people, not through any sort of public campaign.
No, I don't think you can either.
So, and I appreciate what you're saying about Kaufman and the NCAA. We're seeing now a few states that have gone through and passed laws to prohibit native mascots, and some create conditions where if they can get permission or do something or make arrangements.
There's 4 right now, 4 states.
And part of that concern that I have is that's still just 4 states. I mean, and granted, it's more than none, but I look at someplace like New York that they do have a bill on the books, but I got to ask you, because I know your documentary on separation of church and state, delves into law, and so I mean, one of the questions that I'm hitting people with, including the Commissioner of Education here in New York State, is you have existing law, you have anti-bullying laws, you have anti-discrimination laws. You as a commissioner, somebody charged with this in this position, following a commissioner from 20 years ago, when Commissioner Mills from New York basically told schools, you need to get rid of these things. He just didn't create an official mandate. But 20 years later, you can use existing laws that didn't exist 20 years ago and take that authority as the Commissioner of Education and prohibit it. And I wonder how many states have existing laws that if they do have a state education department, which I assume most of them do, do they really have to wait for legislative action that can, sometimes take decades? I mean, I was really disappointed, again, during the Obama administration, when Arne Duncan, he basically whiffed. He hardly said anything about the native mascot issue. I mean, even if you couldn't mandate or dictate, as they say, I mean, he offered almost nothing in the conversation. It's like, how is that even possible? I mean, right now in New York, the New York Association of School Psychologists have basically advocated a ban. I mean, I would think you throw that on the desk of Dr. Betty Rose, the Commissioner of New York State Education Department. Does she need anything more than that?
Well, yeah.
I don't know.
You shouldn't need anything more than that, right? I guess, you'd have to look at each individual state and each individual community as to, how much power or influence, each of those boards has. One thing you have to keep in mind, though, and since now I'm aware of where you live and where you're from, so, you're in upstate New York, which is very different from that bottom part there.
Yeah, I'm in Western New York. Cambridge is near Albany, but I'm living in Seneca territory, so I'm 30 miles south of Buffalo. And you're right, the pockets of right-wing conservatism still lace through a state like New York. I mean, just like they do in California, even so.
So what you also have to understand is very often the members of the school board, the school superintendent, et cetera, in these communities grew up and came from those communities. And so they're already invested in this mascot. Mm-hmm. So, it's really, so it's not that you're always having school superintendents or administrators who are sort of neutral parties. They're not. Right. That happens here all the time. I go to my kids' school, and, I'm amazed at how many of the teachers all came from this area. And Champaign-Urbana, so, it's a lot like maybe Manhattan in that it's a fairly liberal little island, right? But then as soon as you step off that island, it gets completely conservative.
When you open up the gates and let football fans come in, all of a sudden you get a different environment.
Well, that's where a lot of them come
exactly,
from.
Yeah.
But, also the teachers who teach in the Champaign public schools, a lot of them grew up in those towns and grew up that way. And then that's something that I've had open discussions with my daughter, is we talk about, where's this teacher from? Like, did they grow up here? To try to get a sense of, just where they're coming from, to get a handle on. And a lot of times it's on this issue. My daughter had a teacher. It's not uncommon, I guess, for teachers to show up wearing Chief Illini shirts in the public school. And this is what place where you're absolutely correct. There are already rules on the books that would absolutely forbid it, but you have to get an administrator to admit that there's something wrong with that image, that it's the same or it's analogous to, KKK imagery or, other kinds of imagery that you can understand. So, it's not so much even applying that rule, but you're right. Those rules are there already about what teachers can and can't wear, and they can't wear something that's racially insulting. But then they put that on, and everybody in the school who runs it, they don't understand that image is also racially insulting.
Well, so the big push right now is diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is the schools are being encouraged, if not forced, to adopt what they call, again, diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. Their staff members are going through trainings, and it's all about trying to diminish discrimination, racism, and if you ask anybody who does diversity, equity, and inclusion training, can you effectively institute a program of diversity, equity, and inclusion in a school that's appropriating an image of a people, promoting a stereotype and creating that level? And they said, no, you can't. I mean, so you're right. So there's rules, there's policies, and there are laws that are on the books right now.
Yeah.
What I will say about what's happening in New York, and in fact, I've been battling my old high school in Cambridge, New York, and they had a small school board, only 5 people on it. When I first went to Cambridge in November with my request for them to drop the mascot, early on, I think 4 of those board members were prepared to vote to drop the mascot. One of them was really dug in. But as the heat built up over it and the vitriol started, one of the board members resigned, just flat out resigned. So now I had 3 against 1 essentially. So I had 3 board members. Well, when because she resigned, at the next board election there would be 2 vacancies to fill, not just one. And one of them would be filled immediately, and the other one wouldn't get filled until the next board meeting or something like that. So in June, after a really extended delay, and I started this process in March or in November, they were supposed to vote on this thing in March, and they didn't. They decided they were going to bring in some conflict resolution teams and do healing circles to make people feel better about, I don't know what they're supposed to feel better about. But anyway, so that's what they tried, and they went really badly. Those turned into almost debacles. When they were doing them online, Zoom, it was fine. But when they started doing live events, they almost turned into brawls. I mean, it was terrible. So in June, they were going to put it to vote. They read a resolution to retire the mascot, and they were going to vote on it, but didn't. They didn't vote on it. Instead, the superintendent and the board president kind of backed off a little bit and said, well, we could draft another resolution where we keep the name but get rid of the imagery. And so they decided they would draft another resolution, come back in 2 weeks or a week or something like that, and then they would hold a vote. So that's still in June. In the week between that is when news of the New York State Association of School Psychologists, I think the Washington Post did an article, or the heat got turned up on Cambridge, and the attention to Cambridge kind of grew. And in that week between those two, there was enough of a change. Now, keep in mind, the one newly elected board member and these 2 board members ran solely on the mascot issue. That happens
all the time. Sure.
So the one new board member, so now they had a complete board of 5 people, and it looked like there was 2 that were staunch advocates for the mascot and 3 that weren't. And so they voted for a resolution to keep the name but change the imagery, and it failed. So then they turned around and voted for the original resolution, which was to retire the mascot, and it passed 3-2.
Huh.
The next month, when that other board member got seated because they
Right.
lost one of the
But
three,
right.
now they had a 3-2 majority, and they immediately,
Yeah.
without looking at any of the information, they immediately went and voted to rescind the last resolution and reinstate the mascot. So that's July. In August, this is the right calendar here. In August, a number of families in Cambridge filed what they call the 310 petition with the New York State Department of Education, suggesting that vote in July was arbitrary and capricious and was creating an environment that was
I remember
harm.
I read all about this. I didn't know that that was your school.
That's my school. That's my alma mater. So
Yeah,
so
'cause
the
I
commissioner
posted about that.
Okay, good. So the commissioner takes the petition and then issues a stay. They were actually asking for a stay to
Yep.
do away with the reinstatement of the mascot, and she issues it in August.
Right.
And then Cambridge does nothing. And so now she just recently issued a couple of reprimands to Cambridge saying, you better do something. My order is clear, and I have the authority to remove officers and cut funding to your school. So you better start doing what what the order suggests. And even though it's only a stay, this stay could be in place for a year or two.
I actually got this up on my website on my list of schools that have changed. And so you may be interested. This is the way I sort of read and understood it based on just reading the story. So you can tell me if it's right or wrong. And it's meant to be short though, but it was listed on, I have these chronologically. So, listed August 25, 2021, Cambridge Central School will not have a nickname or mascot this year after New York State Education Commissioner Betty Rosa issued a stay on a July 8th school board vote to reinstate the Indian nickname and mascot. The board had voted on June 17 to retire the Indian nickname and mascot by a 3-2 vote. That decision was reversed on July 8th, also by a 3-2 vote when a new member joined the school board. So that's my description on now of, because I have this list of schools as they change chronologically.
Sure.
And, each time there'd be something with Cambridge and I have to erase the old one, And so this is where I'm updated to right now, which did that sound reasonably accurate?
And where it's at now is a number of families who were the petitioners reached out to the New York State Department of Education and said, look, they're not doing anything. Your order was that they had to abide by the resolution of June, which meant you had to take certain measures. You had to remove the imagery where you could. If you have existing uniforms or something that you've ordered, you can still use that stuff, but you need to start demonstrating stuff. And that order also said you needed to make, the resolution said that they had to create a plan for naming a new mascot. These are all the things the school was supposed to have done, and they did none of it. So she sends a letter essentially reprimanding the school and basically saying, now I want you to send me clear documentation that you are moving in that direction. So, and now that's the news story. In fact, I just gave an interview to a television station out there in the Albany area about this. So again, as it stands, Cambridge doesn't have a mascot, and they are ordered essentially by the New York State Commissioner to fulfill its resolution to retire the mascot. Now, the interesting thing here is this an overreach by the commissioner? Because some of the and even the superintendent in an article in the paper called the Times Union had suggested some concern about the fact that could this commissioner make all schools change their mascots if they don't do it on their own, and so it raises an interesting question. But what really the crux of this debate was that newly seated board members ran solely on the platform of keeping the mascot, and never considered any of the information. They have thousands of pages. I mean, they've got, you know, as you mentioned earlier, they've got every native territory that's issued a resolution. They've got the American Psychological Association, the New York State Association of School Psychologists. They've got individual testimony, and I provided a bunch of information. But there's thousands of pages of documents, and without looking at any of it, they just did a knee-jerk vote to rescind the retirement resolution. And that is what Rosa essentially is saying was arbitrary and capricious and harmful. And now there are kids that are being essentially being bullied because they're the kids of some of the parents who did some of this. I mean, it's not it's not a pretty situation. But I guess what I wonder is, did Cambridge create the environment for Dr. Rosa to say, as the New York State Commissioner of Education, it is time that we have a firmer stance on this? You know, my 20-year-old predecessor from 20 years ago issued a statement. Maybe it's time for me to issue an order. And this isn't about necessarily overriding a school board. In many ways, and you know this yourself, this is a relief, because there are many school boards who know what they should do, but don't want to have to do it because they don't want to have to face the public.
Yeah, some of them, right. Some of them do. You know, I have this great quote that I got from a principal. I don't know if we have time now. If we do, if we could, I'll look it up for you. That really gets to the crux of the research and all that. I don't know. Do we have time now?
No, go ahead.
Let me just see if I can take a minute. Let me just see if I can find it quickly. If I can't find it quickly, then forget it, because it's buried in other stuff. But
one of my favorite quotes that came from a New York or from Lancaster High School out here in Western New York from the superintendent, and it was in response to all this cry for a public referendum, and he said, issues of social justice should not be determined in the same way that a prom queen is selected. And I thought that was a great quote.
That is great. Okay, let me just see. All right. So there is this beautiful statement that this woman made, and I think she was the principal of the school, and I tried to remember to flag it.
I'm the same way.
And now I'm searching for it like I always do, right? Like, where did I put that? All right, hang on. Maybe I'm hoping I tagged it in a way that.
I mean, I think it's some of the work that's been done, and again, I do applaud the work that you've done. But, you know, as it stands, I mean, I think some of the work that folks like Stephanie Freiberg has done, and how often her work has been cited. I had her on my program here a couple of weeks ago, and she needs to really be applauded for really setting the standard from a psychologist standpoint, and really detailing. Although most of her detailing is the harm done to Native kids, I still think that there needs to be a more thorough evaluation on how much the non-Native kids are damaged by this, because I don't think that should be downplayed. I think it's significant. And me as a Native person, and I think about my kids, they're going to face those white kids later on, and the level of ignorance that they're carrying with them from their school experiences. It's like the guy from the Department of Commerce in Washington. I mean, and that's what we face. Any luck?
No, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
When I find it, I'll email it to you just so you can have it.
Okay, great.
It really, it was just such a well-spoken, very short explanation by a local school principal about why you have to do this, and there's nothing to even question about it. That this is just has to happen.
And I hate to compare, you know, the racism that Native people have experienced in any way, but certainly in the mascot issue to what others have experienced, and you know, but you have to do. I mean, I do the RG3
you do have to do it,
head thing, but if we all know that blackface is wrong, how is it possible that redface isn't? I mean, and isn't throwing on a headdress the same as redface? I mean, and literally some of these folks, I think about the image of the guy from the Cleveland baseball fan with his red face standing face to face against, you know, I mean, And white people didn't want to give up blackface. They didn't want to give it up. They look, Al Jolson was the number one entertainer in the United States of his time. And that's why you still see these pictures come from the governor of Virginia or the prime minister of Canada when they, when they were doing blackface in college. I mean, these things persist, but they know it's wrong and they have to do damage control. And yet 50,000 people can show up in a football stadium in red face and in feathers and, in all of this, this cheap knockoff mockery. And people are okay with it. I have conversations with people in my own family sometimes over this. And again, older folks kind of accept it. Well, it is what it is, and it's always been that way. And I'm saying, no, but it doesn't always have to be that way. And as you have indicated, the good news is we're winning this. And
we are winning.
And look, we're not winning because of Washington. Washington changed because of us. I mean, we forced this change.
Absolutely.
And there will be a time where there'll be no schools that have Native mascots. But here's the part that concerns me. The part that concerns me is we still owe the kids an explanation. And the fact that this could linger, and have lingering resentment with kids because of how angry their parents might be. All these guys who peaked in high school who can't get over having worn this, these uniforms or whatever else. I'm sorry, but I had to say it. Oh, yeah. But I mean, I think we owe it to these kids to explain it, and shame on teachers who are unwilling. And this is something that could be dealt with in from a literature standpoint, from organizations like the theater programs, from and not just in sports and not just in history, and frankly, could be even be dealt with in science to some extent. These are the kids deserve an explanation. They not only deserve an explanation as to why it should change, but why it did change.
Yeah, I think what I've seen now is that those kids, that generation, they're sort of the only ones left in those ages advocating for these kind of things. I think your average kid who isn't a child of a parent who is like super into the team or sports or whatever, I think the average kid understands right away what's wrong and that it's got to go. So I think, and I'm not talking necessarily because they learn in school, but I think they get it through the air, through the internet. I've really found that. And so like the only, I think, group left that's still fighting for it in these kids age group are those that, had parents who are hardcore. But I can't tell you how many people I've met, who have told me, yeah, God, my dad used to be the biggest chief thing, and they were able to make that leap. But anyways, I think more and more just kids who don't have any preconceived ideas about this are more and more get it right from the start. I really do. And that's a change. And that's changed, I think, just in the last several decades, where I just think, yeah, the average kid pretty much gets it right away.
Jay did send me that statement he was looking for. This is from Principal Lisa Delonis of Pocatello High School in Idaho. As professionals, we are bound to recognize and implement the most current and relevant research in order to provide the best education and the best educational environment for our students. We don't say, in my opinion. We say research shows. Research is the cornerstone of education. On this topic of whether or not to retire the Pocatello High School Indian name and mascot, the research is compelling. Native American mascots harm Native American students. In fact, they harm other students as well. Jay suggests this statement should be sent to every school board member, principal, chancellor, president, and administrator of every school in the United States that has a Native mascot. I'll add that perhaps state education departments need to be added to that list. I want to encourage our listeners to check out In Whose Honor. The film is just as relevant today as it was back in 1997. You can find it online by searching for In Whose Honor with a question mark at the end. I want to thank Jay Rosenstein for joining me on this episode of Let's Talk Native. As always, if you like what you hear, you can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. You can follow the show on Twitter at Let's Talk Native. You can also follow us on Instagram at Let's Talk Native TV. You can also join our Facebook group page. I am John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.